Welcome to CivilNet. Our guest again, and we're grateful, is Professor Keith Watenpaugh, who is at the University of California, Davis, a historian who heads the Human Rights Initiative there. But he's talking to us from Denver, where he's attending the Middle East Studies Association annual conference. Thank you, Keith. Welcome back to CivilNet.
Thank you, Salpi. It's a pleasure.
It is a pleasure talking to you. I'm sorry we're talking about really complex and just getting harder subjects. The meeting took place in Doha of the various elements of the Syrian opposition. There is a coalition, a tentative coalition of sorts, and it is on the one hand being rejected by some of the Syrian elements, on the other hand being recognized by some international forces, states, France, Turkey, Great Britain, the US perhaps. What do you think? Is it getting more complicated or easier?
Well, the creation of this new coalition out of Qatar, and the Doha Group, we'll just call it now for shorthand, we thought held great promise in terms of creating a unified leadership of the Syrian opposition, something that the international community could talk to, a mailing address, if you will, especially in terms of trying to help the Syrian rebels adhere to international standards of humanitarian warfare. I know that's kind of oxymoronic,
wow.
But take prisoners.
The rules of war, at least, yes.
Rules of war, right? International humanitarian law. But word comes to us this morning that several major fighting groups on the ground in Syria, I mean the men with guns who are fighting and dying every day, are rejecting outright the Doha Group, primarily because these organizations, the ones in Syria, Al-Nusra Front being the most prominent, see a future for Syria which includes a adherence or strict adherence to Islamic law. These range from simple sort of Sunni, conservative Sunni organizations to true Salafi groups. So I think the situation has grown more complicated. But here's the issue. Here's the point. The Doha Group has been recognized by powerful European states, and they will begin to funnel aid directly to them and cut off or at least interfere with aid coming to the groups that reject the Doha Group. So this may, initially, there's rejection and there's jockeying and there's politics, but the groups represented at Doha are the ones that are going to get the bulk of the assistance, and I think this will begin to matter on the battlefield and in political negotiations.
And we can only hope that at the same time their real legitimate ability to represent the Syrian people matches the assistance they get rather than one influencing the other. What's the talk there in the corridors at Mesa? Are academics taking sides?
I think most academics we talk to, and there are some fairly important ones here at the conference that work on Syria, including Josh Landis, Max Weiss, the Turkish scholar Seda Altuğ. We, of course, our primary concern are our friends and family in Syria. I mean, all of us have close connections to the country, and we're terribly worried about it. We've done years and years of field work there, and it's a very important place to us. And I think the growing consensus is that Syria will begin to break up into smaller subunits. We call it the Lebanization of the Syrian civil war. And as we know from our experience in Lebanon, that war went on and on and on. It consumed half a generation. So our real concern is that there's really no end in sight. And even with the decapitation of the regime, say for example, Bashar al-Assad is killed or assassinated, that the formation of these militias, who are not united, sure, particularly, will lead to this fracturing of Syria and the creation of a sort of a big Lebanon, if you will.
And there isn't the wherewithal in Syria, the political sense or sophistication to try to put some of this together. I mean, there was in Lebanon, and look how far that got us. It took 15 years.
Exactly. And the Lebanese civil war only ended with Syrian intervention. So, I mean, and now who's the big brother who's going to come across the border? I mean, is it going to be Turkey? Is it going to be Iran? I mean, I think these are all sort of non-starters. I mean, Syria is really a country that's fractured along all sorts of different lines. Of course, there's the religious the Sunni Shia, the Sunni Alawite line. There's also the north-south divide with Aleppo and its hinterland and Damascus and its hinterland, with really Homs and Hama making up their own region. And then there's this really truly important emerging dichotomy between Arab Syria and Kurdish Syria. And so these lines of these fracture lines, these fault lines within Syria become the determinant of how the violence itself is unfolding. And again, I think we're thinking that everyone there's sort of this sense amongst refugees we were hearing that it's this hatred of Bashar al-Assad which is driving them, and that once he leaves, everything will be just fine. And our consensus is that that's far from the truth. That the conflict will persist long after he leaves power, one way or the other.
The refugee issue, obviously it has all sorts of ramifications, of course, for the Armenian communities as well. And what seems to be happening more and more is that those who appeared intransigent, appeared unwilling to recognize and move, are now recognizing and moving. And will the dispossession of the Armenian community, for example, one minority of Syria, will that in any way make the problem easier? In other words, if some of these disparate groups disappear, will the political process be affected in any way at all?
I think it's very important to draw a historical lesson from what happened to Anatolia after the genocide. Here we have Anatolia, which was a very diverse place, large concentrations of Armenians and Greeks and other non-Muslim minorities, non-Turkic minorities within Anatolia. After the end of the First World War, Turkey was ethnically cleansed of its Armenians and its Greeks, and it's allowed first a secular nationalist Turkey to emerge, and now a religious Turkey to emerge, one in which essentially a Muslim Brotherhood-style political party doesn't have to worry about protecting the rights of its non-Muslim minorities, because in Turkey there really almost are no non-Muslim minorities. We're talking about less than 1% who have really no political clout, no ability to sort of have to be placated through the political process. And so in Syria, the Islamization, if you will, of Syria, especially the big Arab Sunni towns of Aleppo, Homs, Hama, and Damascus, the elimination of the non-Muslim minorities will allow for a much less secular, much more Islamist government to take shape in Syria. But that assumes, of course, that there's not resistance from, say, secularizing Kurds. So, but in many ways, were the minorities in Syria no longer there, the political dynamic that would support Islamism would I think be accelerated, would take hold faster. And this is really terrible because Syria has a long history of being a multicultural cosmopolitan society where its prosperity was in part a function of its minority communities.
And yet look at Iraq, where you could kind of have said the same thing, and now look, it's fragmented or federalized, huh? It's got the structured fragmentation now that kind of sort of seems to be working.
Right. Well, in the reason why Iraq has become reasonably peaceful. We still have car bombings at least once or twice a week, but is essentially that Sunnis and Shia have been ethnically separated, have been sorted in a way, and this followed a very bloody conflict in Baghdad, where Shia militias and the worked to remove Sunnis from large portions of the city of Baghdad and essentially concentrate them in the provinces where they were from along the Euphrates River. So, this doesn't really bode well for any kind of multicultural Syria going forward. And I know that that's part of American policy, is to try to ensure the persistence of a minority community or of diversity in the Middle East. And Syria is the most diverse Middle Eastern country anymore. But that's the future prospects for that are really remote. And again, I think that those of us who've worked on Syria for many years, one of the reasons we were attracted to work on Syria was precisely this diversity. Armenians and Alawites and Yazidis and Kurds and old Sunni families and Druze. This made it a very, very interesting place, and I think that's disappearing quickly.
You know, the tone of our conversation today is very different from the tone of our previous two conversations, and we'll give our viewers a link to those other two so that they can compare how things have changed over time. But in those other two conversations we talked about, and we should talk about again, about the implications of a disappearing Armenian community. I mean, the irony
Sure.
lost on no one, right? This was the deported, dispossessed of Anatolia, and now what, where, how?
So really over the last 100 years, through genocide and emigration, the minorities, the Christian minorities of the Middle East have been moving out. They've been going to Western Europe, North and South America, where they've become integrated into those societies and really help them add to their diversity and to their prosperity. And they've taken that business acumen and access to the West with them as they've left. But the civil war in Syria, I think, will, and I've said this before, is that I think this will make that process go much faster. And at some point, I just don't see how the Armenian community can really persist in Aleppo if the only people who are left are old people or maybe some children. That there's the critical mass of a community
Is missing.
is no longer there.
Right, the vitality's gone.
Right, and so that the loss of that, and we've been talking about this at the Middle East Studies meeting as well, which is that aside from the human cost, the pain of exile and emigration, it's really that these final two functioning Western Armenian communities, Watenpaugh in Beirut and Aleppo in Syria, that these two communities are where the traditions and the language and the poetry and the music of Western Armenia was protected and was promoted. And with the loss of these communities, Western Armenian becomes a museum piece. It's no longer a living language. It becomes something like Latin or like Greek, ancient Greek. And I think that's something that Armenians should be particularly concerned about and begin to prepare and think about ways to ensure that Western Armenian culture and tradition and language is somehow protected as a living language, as a living way of life, and not just something that we read about in history books and visit at the museum.
Well, I'm tempted to say something controversial to end this with, and that community perhaps will be
Sure.
Istanbul in some ironic sense, but that's for another conversation. Thank you, Keith Watenpaugh, Professor of History from the University of Davis, currently in Denver at the Middle East Studies Association Conference, talking with us about the current, hopefully short, but certainly difficult phase of the Syria conflict. Thank you for watching CivilNet.
Thank you, Salpi.